The World Is Not Enough video game is awful, but also kind of great. Allow me to explain. As a kid, I loved this game, specifically the PlayStation version. Hell, I wasn't even aware that there was a completely different version for the N64 until years down the line. But much like Tomorrow Never Dies, I never finished the game. I never figured out quite how to make it past the helicopters in the second before last level. But I played so much of it that to this day, some of the music and specific NPC lines pop up in my head for no real reason, despite not having played it in over 20 years.
Good afternoon, Dr. Arkov.
I've held it in such high regard that I always put it up there toe-to-toe with some of my favorite PlayStation games of all time. And I've been a staunch defender of it, whenever it popped up in conversation online. So yeah, to say that my expectations were pretty high when sitting back to play this after so long would be quite an understatement. And I decided to play it back to back with the N64 version to compare both and get some kind of vindication for my younger self, to give him some assurance that he didn't miss out on the real World Is Not Enough experience. And he had in fact played the better game. After all, GoldenEye had left a rather sour taste in my mouth, and the N64 version looked quite similar. And here's the thing though, me and my younger self were wrong. Like, very, very wrong. And that realization was immediately obvious. When first booting up the PlayStation version, I was greeted with the usual loading screen, which is basically the poster from the movie. And just between us, I was immediately reminded of my pervy 10-year-old self, staring at Denise Richards' see-through tank top for just far too long, honestly. Seriously though, Denise Richards doesn't lend her voice to the game, which might actually be for the best considering her performance in the movie. Neither is Pierce Brosnan or the rest of the main cast, all of whom as usual are replaced by low-quality impersonators.
I'm here to see Lachaise. The name's Bond, James Bond.
The only actor to make a return is John Cleese as Q's assistant, R. Not surprising really, as we'll be seeing in the next few games, that man says yes to just about everything his agent puts in front of him.
Disguised as a small flashlight, this device emits a quiet high-intensity charge that will temporarily blind anyone facing it.
That little digression gets me to the actual first negative point. The overall presentation is very poor. From the menus to the terrible voice acting and using clips from the movie to connect between levels that are so condensed and poorly cut that it's almost like they're trying to avoid a YouTube copyright claim. It's all very unstylish, I guess would be the way to describe it. And it's a shame because this is Bond we're talking about. Style is one of his main things. There's also a noticeable lack of attention to detail, which can be seen in things like the same character having two different voice actors.
Sorry, Doctor. I cannot allow you to pass without a radiation badge.
Good afternoon, Dr. Arkov.
Above all things, The World Is Not Enough is ugly, even by PS1 licensed game standards. I didn't remember it being such a blocky, grainy mess visually, and I like to think that I noticed those things as a child. But none of the locations, characters, or effects stand out positively. What does stand out are some interesting variations to the GoldenEye formula. Tomorrow Never Dies developer Black Box was also tasked with creating this version of the game. And unlike its third-person predecessor, The World Is Not Enough returns to a first-person perspective for its gameplay, clearly trying to recapture some of that lightning-in-a-bottle magic that GoldenEye had. That being said, some elements are heavily streamlined, like making the levels much more linear, which basically turns it into a corridor shooter, and adding a few extra touches, like adding a few missions that focus on stealth. It's also a little faster overall. It is not really as smooth, but the auto-aim is actually very generous. That's not to say that the gameplay is fun, really. The shooting never quite clicks. The lack of standout animations on the enemies or generally terrible sound effects make the shooting very unsatisfying as a whole. Gunning down enemies becomes a button mashing slog, not helped by some of the more archaic design elements of its era, like needing to be in very specific and exact positions to trigger some actions, and the weapon and item selection are awkwardly mapped to the same button. So if I needed to use a specific item, I needed to slowly swipe across several to finally get to it, all the while probably being shot at. This created some frustrating moments that, more often than not, ended in mission failure. Also frustrating is the lack of an auto reload once a weapon runs out of ammo, which paired with the painfully slow reloading animation got me into some less than favorable situations one time too many. Maybe this is why, besides the auto-aim, the developers were very generous with the armor packs. They helped mitigate some of the damage taken by these clunky controls. At least strafing works this time, and it's useful when turning around corners to surprise incoming enemies. The game is at its best when it throws different gameplay elements at you to break the pacing from the obtuse and monotonous shooting. From the first mission, it's clear how much more important the gadgets are to the overall gameplay, compared to the other games we've talked about on the channel so far. As a disruptor hidden on a pen is necessary to enter the bank without setting up the alarms. And by the end of the level, Bond would be using the fingerprint scanner built into his cell phone. The same one from Tomorrow Never Dies, by the way, which gives it a nice touch of continuity. This cell phone will be used to scan the fingerprints of a security guard and gain access to the room where the target is located.
The report that Sir Robert King bought was stolen from an MI6 agent who was killed for it. I want to know who killed him.
Later on, there's a casino level where the entirety of the missions focuses on winning a few rounds of blackjack to gain enough funds to blackmail Sukowski. A fun mission moment that harkens back not just to the movies but also to the Marrakesh casino mission in the Game Boy game. Immediately following that, there's a couple of missions focused on stealth. In Elektra's mansion, Bond is tasked with tapping phones and photographing incriminating documents, all the while avoiding security guards. Then, in a Kazakhstan nuclear facility, he has to pose as a nuclear scientist, so the gameplay focuses on tasks not related to gunplay. As he walks around the facility, going from room to room collecting items, and showing his stolen identity card so as to avoid suspicion. This is a clever mission design. However, it's a shame then that the enemy AI isn't better, because they make these types of missions a breeze. Once I figured out that instead of carefully hiding and avoiding enemies, I could just walk towards and shoot them with a sleeping dart while they took their sweet time to react, and they would eventually wake up as if nothing had happened, it became too obvious that there was an easier and faster way to go about the objectives. The idea is there, and if I wanted to approach it more stealthily, I could. But the way I could so easily find a walkaround was disappointing. Later on, there's a somewhat interesting level where Bond has to destroy a few helicopters. And after disposing of the first two with a missile launcher, destroying the third one requires the player to traverse the level with a wrench, which in turn needs to be used to open a gas valve, which shoots up a gas cloud that Bond can then shoot to blow the helicopter to pieces. It's really cool and it makes you feel like you are actually taking an active participation in the mission. But these interactive moments come very scarcely in between some very monotonous shootings. Credit where credit's due though. The game does end with a bang. After the 3 standout casino and stealth levels, we are treated to some more shooting slog complete with bullet sponge boss fights, before being thrown into the sinking submarine from the end of the movie. While nowhere near as impressive as the N64 version of its final mission, the ticking time bomb, the maze-like nature of the environment, and the sluggish controls do blend well to create a legitimately tense final moment. It's all for the wrong reasons, but there's at least a feel of excitement that I hadn't had before. It doesn't make up for the drag that comprises the bulk of the game, but at least you could say it ends on a somewhat positive note, I guess. Overall, The World Is Not Enough on the PlayStation is a weird mismatch of new ideas, leftover elements from Tomorrow Never Dies, and trying to recapture the GoldenEye magic. It puts it in a weird place where all it does is remind you of better features from other games, but it never really builds to anything that is entirely satisfying or fun. It's sad that it was clearly rushed as it is, and there wasn't probably enough time to put more care into it. Because the next game we're going to be talking about really cements what a missed opportunity it was for those who wanted a great Bond experience on the PlayStation. Let me get straight to the point with this one. The N64 version of The World Is Not Enough is a shockingly good game. Not even just by comparison, but on its own it stands out from every other shooter I've played from this generation, GoldenEye included. It is immediately evident from booting it up how much care and attention was put into this. The presentation is top-notch, and graphically it is an infinitely better looking game than its PlayStation counterpart. And I wouldn't even dare to say that it's better looking than GoldenEye in most places, with some great model work and light effects. It obviously covers the same base story, but it ditches the clips from the movie and replaces them with fully voiced in-engine cutscenes, which was a surprise considering how few N64 games attempted that, let alone at this scale, where nearly every character is fully voice acted, and Bond has a response for every situation.
What are you doing here?
Sorry to disturb you.
James.
Stay here, you'll be safe.
And needless to say, John Cleese is here too.
Remember, 007, you need to utilize all of your stealth training to avoid detection while in the villa. Avoid confrontation at all costs.
All of this gives it a charm that is very unique to this game. And the music, as usual, well, it slaps. Since we're following the same story, the levels remain essentially the same, with a few additions and one glaring omission. The casino level is completely absent, and I can only imagine it probably has everything to do with Nintendo not wanting any type of gambling in their family-friendly console. Although that doesn't really explain why blackjack is actually playable in the Game Boy game. Huh. But I digress, it's not here and that's what's important. Still, despite the fact that it shares locations and some aesthetics, the level design is completely different. Here, the levels are open-ended and objectives can be approached from different angles. It's similar to GoldenEye in this regard, except that these levels feel more involved. There's a lot more going on and they're not as empty. And in some instances, we have to backtrack to a previously visited section of the level, making good use of the vast design of the levels. Maybe this is just by nature of this particular movie's locations making for more engaging video game levels than in GoldenEye, but everything felt more alive in this one, which in turn made it more memorable for me. But beyond all these positives, where it truly stands out is in the gameplay itself. Everything is faster paced, and having a dedicated jump button actually helps a lot in making the movement feel more fluid. The weapon selection is mostly the same, but the N64 puts a wider variety of gadgets at your disposal. There is a heavier focus on using gadgets overall to deal with several objectives. Some of these are also on the PS1 version, but they never felt useful beyond the contained moments the game requires their use. Here, having items like the X-ray glasses or the grappling hook helps in how Bond interacts with the environment, and other characters as well. Speaking of other characters, the animation on every enemy is sublime. Seeing their different reactions to being shot makes the gunplay endlessly more satisfying. And having them be this good goes a long way to making objectives like the stealth mission on Electra's mansion more immersive than on PlayStation. But, despite me gushing so much about the animations and characters, probably the biggest flaw of the game comes from its placement of NPCs. Almost every level is packed full of civilians and allies who can be killed in friendly fire. And they have a nasty habit of getting in the way of the action or jumping immediately towards you as you enter the room, which in the heat of the moment it's not hard to mistake them for enemies. These guys, including most readily of all M on the second level, cost me more than a few game overs over several levels, and combined with a few escort missions made for really frustrating moments. Luckily, these moments are made up for with some truly creative set pieces. Cold Reception, a level based on the ski chase from the movie that on PlayStation was reduced to shooting flying enemies from the ground, is translated here as a cinematic on-rails segment, at a time when they weren't as commonplace in shooters, no less. Which is not only more faithful to the movie, but a thrill to boot. Then there's Underground Uprising, a completely original level that has Bond looking for a bomb inside the London Underground. And the final mission in the submarine is essentially a water level. That is a bit tricky to traverse, but once I got the hang of it, it turns into a satisfying finale for what is an overall terrific adventure.
I've always wanted to have Christmas in Turkey.
I came out of this game surprised and actually bummed out that I had missed on the clearly superior version for over 20 years. As a child, I would have gone nuts for this. And as an adult, going back to these games, it's the first time the GoldenEye formula actually clicked for me. The World Is Not Enough takes what Rare did and builds upon it, turns it up a notch and perfects it as much as it's possible on a console like the N64. It even has a fully featured multiplayer mode for up to 4 people, with the possibility of adding bots. So I'm not sure why this isn't held in higher regard. It should at the very least be thought of as being shoulder to shoulder with GoldenEye, as far as I'm concerned. My only guess is that it's unfairly lumped over with the PlayStation version, and also EA's other low quality efforts from that generation. Also, the fact that the movie itself is not only not as popular as GoldenEye, but also commonly ranked in the lower tier of Bond movies doesn't do it any favors. Is it too crazy to call this a hidden gem? Because I honestly think that we should. Thankfully, developer Eurocom would come back to the series a few years later to develop what would become one of the best all-time games in the franchise. Much like the movie they were based on, which is an inconsistent product that has in equal parts some of the coolest and some of the worst moments in the series, the video game adaptations of The World Is Not Enough showcase the opposite extremes that this franchise can reach in video game form. It is fascinating that the two exist and can be compared and analyzed, but ultimately one is so clearly superior that it drops the other from any relevancy. Thanks for watching the video and making it this far if you did. Yeah, I didn't include the Game Boy Color adaptation in this one, which is an entirely different game more similar to James Bond 007 on the original Game Boy, but with a few different touches. Mostly because I think that deserves its own look, and I'll hopefully be getting to that sometime soon. If that's something that you'd like to see, consider subscribing, liking and sharing most of all. If you want to watch more videos about James Bond games that I've made, please check this out, and yeah, I'll see you on the next one. Bye.